The Flexbox is good at laying things out in a way that flows. Okay, so it sets things next to each other. You can change the packing, the margin, and just let things flow and expand automatically. Right. You might actually be asking, and if you're not, I recommend that you ask.
Okay.
Is the Flexbox what's used to implement tiles on the start screen in Windows 8? And the answer to that question that you're asking would be no. Because although it looks very similar, the feature that is used on the start page and the feature that you can use to create tiles in your app, those are different controls because they add a lot more power. We'll dig into that in a later section.
Cool.
But let's look for now at the grid. So the grid is better at absolute layout, okay? Flexboxes flow their children, and grids control their children and tell them where they're supposed to go.
Yeah.
Okay, so it really is the power of tables. We used to use tables for layout a lot, and it was nice because you could just very absolutely say, here's what happens on the left, 180
it's
pixels.
It's funny that you say used to. I think many still do, but yes.
Yeah, and technically by used to, I could refer to, 15 minutes ago we were using tables to lay out our content.
Right.
So you get that same power of using tables, but this is very different because it's implemented in the CSS. So it's not a part of your structure in HTML. You get to specify it in your CSS, which means that you get to respond dynamically, control it from your JavaScript. There's a lot of advantages to putting this in its right place as a style and not as structure.
So if I were going to rephrase what you're saying, instead of me having to use some specific kind of elements like we did with the table, we could be using different kinds of elements and then grouping these in a grid.
Absolutely. And for instance, when the nature of our app changes, so for instance, say we snap our app to the left, now all of a sudden we can change that layout responsibly using our CSS and maybe say instead of 2 columns, I don't have enough room for 2 columns, so let me go ahead and just move where my content move how this grid is defined and where my content goes in it.
Yeah, that's good stuff.
Yeah, it's real good stuff. So we've got absolute rows and columns, and we've also got fractional rows and columns. So we can get expansive and dynamic. We can expand to the size of the container, and we can span rows and columns like we used to in table. And we can also have good control of the alignment inside of these suckers.
Very important.
Yep, very important. So let's go to Code Show, close down all of our Flexbox stuff, and jump over to our grid example. The grid example, again, very little in the way of, almost nothing in the way of CSS here. It's all HTML and CSS. We've got a simple grid first, and the simple grid has A, B, C, and D cells. But look at our HTML. Div, 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 div. Yeah. It's very simple. That's all there is to it. Now our CSS, this is where we get creative and define these. Okay? So these are defined as, of course, they're namespaced to the section in my page that I'm on. And then I'm referring, notice I'm using a child combinator here, not a descendant, so that it doesn't affect all the divs below it. The child of simple should be an MS Grid. We're using the same method, display MS Grid. Now we're defining that we want this grid to have 2 columns of 250 pixels each. Notice that there's a space here, so you can define, this is saying I want 2 columns, and each is absolutely 250 pixels. And same with the rows right there, 250 pixels each.
So if I'm just trying to understand what you're saying here, underneath this, hash simple, you're saying the very first div is going to be kind of like the grid container.
Yes.
And then as you went through and added more of your CSS selectors, then you're able to apply specific things to some of those elements within that grid container.
Let's look actually at what this is going to apply to. Since this is the child div of the simple container, flip back here, here's our simple container. It only has 1 child div. Cool. But it has a lot of descendant divs, but I don't want to affect those with that style rule.
So on a side note, I guess what you're doing is you didn't even apply any classes or any IDs to those divs.
Absolutely.
You're just using their relative position to that ID'd element simple, and you just are saying, hey, the first div or the only one that would be a direct child is our container, and thus becomes our grid.
Absolutely. And it's just one way to do it. You could also decorate these with IDs or classes or whatever.
Sure.
Yep. Now, you might notice that I have defined the grid columns and rows for 3 of my children but my first child I have neglected. Now, the reason why I have been able to neglect that child is because there's a default value for the column and row, and that is 1. Okay? So let me actually do something interesting here and comment out those 3 lines.
Whoa.
Those are no longer taking effect, okay?
Okay.
I am going to run my project, go to the CSS grid, and look at what's going on there. Let me actually bump that font up a little bit by specifying that here. Font size, let's say 32 point. Run that. You see what's happening there?
Yeah.
All of those children are piled up on top of each other because by default they're all in the first row, first column of that grid, and the grid puts all of those things on equal plane. It does not flow them like normal.
So you're saying that if you just put all these things inside of that grid, it's not necessarily going to say, oh, I automatically know you want row 1, you want row 2, you want column 1, everything row 1, column 1.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Absolutely. So let's undo our comment. We might want to go ahead and keep that font size because that was helpful. And run that. And now we're telling our children to go where they're supposed to go, and we see that.
Cool.
Okay? Now that's just putting everything in a different cell and a different from their siblings. But what if we want to do some row spanning? Row spanning, this is actually a 3x3 grid, so we're dealing with 9 squares here.
Really?
Yeah. But the first one, the one that's in 1-1, has a row span of 2. The one that's in 2-2 has a column span of 2. So we can get really creative with where these things go. We can create our headers, we can create our navigation sections, and things like that.
Cool.
We also can get kind of fancy. You can see how you could use the grid to really lay out some nice tiles for yourself. You wouldn't have all of the functionality necessarily of something more robust like a list view, but a grid is a really good way to lay out your tiles.
That's very cool. On that previous example, was that last one also just assuming to be using a 3x3?
No, that's a good question actually. Let's look at the definition of the row span one. The definition of the row span one has 3 columns, I can tell because there are 3 terms to this value. But what's with the center value?
It says 1FR.
Yep, FR. It might be a new unit to you. It stands for fraction. And again, relative. Relative to the other columns in this column definition, I want that one to take up 1 fraction. So I could specify, for instance, another column at 2 fractions, and now this one is going to be twice as big as this one.
Wow.
So what's going to happen is all of the absolute column definitions are going to be applied, and as you can see, we've got 200 pixels taken up there.
Sure.
And then the remaining space in this grid, which is 600 pixels wide, would be 400 pixels.
Would it be safe to say it's absolute by merit that you gave it a specific measurement?
Yeah.
Okay, and so this fractional is the kind of, I'm Lucy, I'll whatever.
Yeah, it's the flexible space.
Cool.
Yep. And the nice thing about doing a grid with some flexible space is that you could, for instance, have the same exact grid definition for your full mode, which is where your app is taking up the entire screen, and your fill mode, which is where the app is taking up the part of the screen that's not in snap view.
Cool.
For instance, if the user has snapped an app next to yours.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So grids are really powerful. You can see in the second section here how we have this row spanning going on. And then in this one, the column spanning.
Yes.
Yeah. And then in the fancy grid, again, just a 3x3 grid. Everybody's going to their places, but the one in 2-1, second column, first row, is told that it should have a row span of 3. And then notice that this one was drastically improved just by giving those individual children a little bit of margin. If you get in the practice of giving your Flexbox and your grid children a margin of 5 pixels, then that will result, when 2 of them are next to each other, in a 10 pixel gap between, which is the design standard for Windows 8.
Very good to know.
Yeah. Now, these children of this grid were not told where in their cell they were supposed to align. The default alignment inside of a grid cell is stretch. So by default, this child div, although it had no size, stretched to the size of the cell of the grid that it was in. That's really helpful for us because we don't have to try to calculate or do 100% or anything like that. We just use stretch, and the contents are automatically stretched for us. We can also use center. There's where our center comes in again, and it can vertically center or horizontally center the contents inside of these grid cells.
That's great.
Extremely handy. In fact, grids and flexboxes are so lightweight to define that you can, remember when we used the definition for table cell to get ourselves some vertical spacing?
Yes.
You can go ahead and just apply the MS Grid if the only thing you want to do is vertically center something, and it's a better way to do it than the table cells.
That's very cool.
Yeah.
That is awesome. Well, I think that's very important to address with regard to our layouts, because we're going to want to explore all the various ways that we can get the content on the screen. So Flexbox for it's not necessarily a grid, but hey, it just flows and it works out great. And with the grid, we have that way to do either at the absolute positioning or even some of the fractional pieces. I love that. I think that's great.
And think about the idea of putting a Flexbox in a grid. Did you know you can also put Flexboxes inside of Flexboxes? Grids inside of grids.
All I can say to that is don't say the word relative again or child or anything, because it's starting to get really confusing with all the family references. So with that, we're gonna switch gears, and we're gonna talk about a different thing that you can do within your application and using these web technologies. We're gonna start to focus now on transforms, transitions, and also animations. So right now on our module agenda, we're going to be taking a look at transforms themselves. And what does it mean to transform? I think in terms of transformation means we're going to change something visually, and then these 4 things that are listed on the screen right now are the different ways that you could do it. And I'll even kind of paraphrase, although the first one's really easy. Rotate, you kind of know what it means. We're going to rotate something on the screen. Skew, the name's kind of good. It could mean that we're going to apply some kind of a odd stretch or angling to a particular element on the screen. Scale may seem intuitive, but if it was called zoom, that might help or blow up, because scaling can actually reduce or expand the size of something on the screen. And then translate, I think that one is probably the one that needs the most help in terms of saying what it does. Translate simply means move over here. It's like transport over here. So a transformation using a translate means that we can actually change the actual value of that element somewhere else on the screen. So it's kind of like a positioning technique. So I would like to demonstrate that. And I'm going to go back here, and once again, I'll run this app first so that we can get the context for what's going on. When I run it, of course, I had that shameless plug of my mugshot here hidden in the Windows Phone, but if people didn't notice this, I had Mr. Jeremy Foster's mugshot sitting right underneath here, this URL that's asking for some information. So I want to apply, I would like to transform you. And that's what I'm going to do right now, is go into the code and see how we can apply some simple transformations and to make your image stand out.
Now, did you talk to my lawyers first?
I did not.
Okay.
So going back over here, I'm going to stop the application and go specifically to the CSS. This is where the magic is going to happen with that particular mugshot of yours. And just to provide the reference for it on the screen, you'll notice I'm using the figure element, which is a HTML5 semantic tag. And you can have multiple things inside of a figure, one of which would be an image. And I'm using the image inside the folder called foster.png. And the ID of my figure is pic. So I'm actually going to apply the transformation to the figure, not specifically the image. And the reason why is because what if I have a fig caption that I wanted to showcase or also involve? Now, going back over to the CSS, how would I go about doing that particular transform?
So Michael, you're saying that the transforms that you're about to apply affect not just an individual element, but an element and all of its Descendants?
And that's a very good point. That is the key. If you want to apply it to the element and everything within it, of course, it would kind of be strange if maybe you just only saw the outer side of something move around or twist and all its insides kind of stay there. It just seems wrong even saying that. So yes, this is going to demonstrate that it's going to take the whole thing and gracefully do a transform to the entire element.
Great.
You're absolutely right. Thanks for asking. So I can apply to the figure, which I called pick, I'm going to use that hover that we discussed earlier. And what I'm going to say here is I'm going to apply a transformation to this when we hover over it. So transform, and now before you were talking about nth child, and you're like, sometimes in CSS we start to treat things as if they're functions. And we're going to see the same thing here with our transform. I can apply something that will look like a function. So I'm going to say scale, and of course, if I wanted to scale you down and make you insignificant, so to speak, no pun intended here, then I would use a decimal like 0.1 or 0.2 to indicate that we're less than 1. 1 would be exactly what it is right now. Consider 1 100%, which would mean 2 would be twice as big as it is right now.
Gotcha.
So I'll apply that scale, and I'm going to stop it right here. And let's just see what happens now when I apply that transformation. So I'm going to hover over CodeFoster, and sure enough, you can see that when I hover, your image and your fig caption, the entire element gets increased. It's kind of going in a strange direction, though. So I wonder if there's something I can do, and I'd like to kind of, just add that little bit of that tilt factor as well. So I'm going to go back over into Visual Studio. Now, you'll notice I kept the actual application running. A technique that you can use when you're doing little tidbits like this is you can say, okay, well, let me just add something else, which, by the way, I can continue to add to this one line. Let's say that right now I want to move it over. So I'll use the translate methodology. And translate means, hey, from where you're at right now, let's go down and over 50 pixels. And by doing that, of course, if I use negative numbers there, then it would mean up and to the other side. But I'm going to go down and over to the right side, and I'm going to click. It might be hard to see, but there's a little icon right up here in Visual Studio, and it also has a keyboard shortcut of Control-Shift-R, which says refresh this app. So when I do that, it's going to now bring back the app, but when I go over here to hover over, it applied that. I didn't have to stop and start the entire application in order for that effect to take place. So there I am. I kind of have some strangeness because it's trying to hover. And it's like, well, where are you? Are you over here? Are you over here? Okay, so that could be, keep that in mind. That could actually be irritating to some. But let's add that little tilt factor as well. So going back over to Visual Studio, again on the same line, I can say, well, let me rotate. And I'll rotate. When you supply this value, let's say I'm just going to rotate you 10 degrees. Just make sure and add that DEG. If you just put a 10 there, it's not going to fly. So with that, I'll go ahead and refresh the app.
Can you specify radians?
I have no idea. So CodeFoster now gets tilted over to the side. Your picture is now bigger. We can see it, and we did that through a transformation. So transforms are pretty simple. Now, I'll keep that rolling, and I now want to get into transitions and animations. They're almost very similar to one another. When we're dealing with transitions, think of it this way. We're dealing with changing the state of something from one state to another, and a classic example of that, even on the web, is when you hover over something. You kind of change the state of something. There's other examples too, like active. If something is an active element on that page, it changed. Or it could be that you might even trigger something programmatically that would alter or change something on the screen. So this is the response to something. In this example, a transition here is, okay, we have some class out there called some class, and we're applying a transition that means if any, so that word all there means if any property that is considered a transitional property, which is most of them, if they change in any way, then for 1 second, let's see that transition. Well, it just happens to be if we're hovering over something and then we change a property like a border radius to 50%, well, then that means instead of just instantly applying that, it's going to take 1 second and kind of gradually fade into it. So that's how it's an animation. So let me demonstrate that really quickly with what I just did with your mugshot. So if I go back over into Visual Studio, I can say, okay, well, at the beginning here, and this is all we need to do, is say, hey, let me apply a transition. The transition is going to be to all. Of course, I could choose specific properties to only. But I'll say, if anything, and I'll make it 2 seconds, which is 2s. Now, if I do that and refresh this, watch what happens when I now hover over your mugshot. Ooh.
Whoa.
Look at that nice, smooth transition. See? So, even makes the tech guys happy.
Your clap just played.
Oh, the clap's working
I think
now.
your audio demo just kicked in.
That's great. All right. Well, there's more to this than just transition. Transitions, by the way, are one of the simplest things that you can apply. Notice that all I had to do was just tell the source element, hey, you know what? If something changes, let's go ahead and apply whatever that is in a nice, graceful way. There's a lot more properties to it, but alas, we don't have time to go into all of them. So I'm going to switch over, and I'm going to stop this and go over to the CodeShow project. And I'm going to open up the animations folder. And specifically, I'm going to get into some of the syntax that can be used for an animation. And I'll talk about how that's different. So, of course, .animations is just like what we talked about before. That's kind of like, because we called this animations, everything's going to have that, quote-unquote namespace thing. But where the animation gets exciting is when we start to see this at keyframes. That at keyframe says, hey, let me make something. It's kind of like a movie in a way. What we're going to do is we're going to name this animation Get Angry. And then we have various positions in that animation where we're going to change some things. So we'll start at 0, and this will be all the properties that will be applied to whatever. And then at 60%, we're going to have this happen. At 80%, we're going to have this. So you can kind of see it's giving us the ability to kind of control what we're going to be doing through this animation. And I'm just changing the values of all sorts of properties. I also have a drop-in animation that just shows how simple it is to just create something that says, okay, we'll start at -100 and we'll end at 100%. So they could be simple or they can be complex when you have all these multiple steps. So how will I apply this Get Angry? I do it by creating an animation inside of, in this example, anything that has the class called animate Get Angry is going to apply an animation called Get Angry, which is what we defined down here, for 5 seconds. And the forwards means, hey, you know what? And when you're done, just stay that way. If I don't apply that property, it goes right back to its original state. So I want it to stay angry, I guess. Well, let's see what this is going to look like when I run it. I'm going to go to Animations and pay attention to this box. I'm going to now click it. And it looks like it's kind of red, angry, and I'm trying to get this Hulk effect, this really angry look, So now it's stayed in that position. If I took the forwards off, then it would have gone right back to just a box. The circle wouldn't be there. The box shadow, which is interesting to note, applies when you have a border radius. Look at that nice effect there. And it all gradually kind of just melded together. So that's really exciting. When we're dealing with animations, think about the potential of what you could do here with your animations. I mean, my goodness, you can change not only things such as color and background. You could also be doing things like literally moving content with the top and the left properties and styling them that way so that you get that really true animation. You could be bringing in images. You could do a lot of that. So this animations is on the CodeShow at codeshow.codeplex.com, and you're welcome to see that example also in fuller detail. And I'll have to just say, it's just a really cool thing that web developers that are so adjusted to using some of these techniques can bring them to the table for app development as well.
Now, I saw you define an animation with that keyframes. Is it possible to trigger that keyframe, that animation, using JavaScript?
It absolutely is. In fact, that is what happened in that example.
I see.
I was able to, and you'll see that at the code sample, in the JavaScript, you can apply that animation by simply applying that class name dynamically.
I see.
And we're going to be getting into a little bit of that a little later on when we get into some DOM manipulations to see how that can happen within the JavaScript itself. But you certainly can be using that for, you can also set it so that it just plays automatically. So if the class name was already on the element, the animation just happens. You didn't even have any control. But I made it so that we can, okay, let's go ahead and click on it. The other thing that you can introduce as well is an animation delay, which means that you want to wait for that animation. You know where you've seen this a lot is you open up a page to some website, and then all of a sudden, like 3 seconds later, this thing just appears out of nowhere and says, "Hi there," blah, blah, blah. You know, there's a delay in that animation. So
like
it wasn't,
Clippy.
yeah, it wasn't something that you clicked. It was just something that happened after a delay. So you could do that as well in your Windows 8 app using all these cool web technologies.
Now, I wanted to add that there's a lot of really good support in the HTML and the CSS space for animation, and all of that works in Windows 8. We'll get more into this, but it's important to know that it's also hardware accelerated. All of these animations are hardware accelerated, so these are running on your machine with hardware acceleration, and that's a tremendous advantage over the same animations running in the web. So that's a huge advantage for us. But also, beyond just the animations that are available to us in CSS, there's also a complete animations library where the Win.js, which we're going to be introduced to tomorrow, it does a lot of stuff for us. So we have a lot more even than what you've seen that CSS gives us.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, we originally were going to have that content at this point, but we really wanted to stay true to what we said earlier, and that is, this is mostly about what you already probably can do in the web world. Let's just kind of stay true to that to the degree possible.
Yep.
And so this is stuff that can be done in browsers that support it now, such as IE 10 or the other browsers. I'll just leave it at that. That also support that. And I think I just want to stress for sure something that Jeremy said, and that is the excitement here of showing you what I just did. Because if I had to show it to you for web development, all those vendor prefixes that you were talking about earlier, they now become just like everything you do, every keyframe, it's just riddled with all of these vendor prefixes to support all these browsers. So not only are we benefiting that we're running in a hardware accelerated platform, it's an app, it's running that, and we're getting all the, the juice of that machine. We're, as developers, thinking how easy it is to develop for, because, again, we're not worried about, well, how is this going to render here and here and here? I just had to apply that one type of animation, and it just worked. So originally it felt wrong because I'm so used to worrying about all these browser issues, and now I'm starting to say, I don't feel wrong about that anymore. I'm enjoying the fact that I have abbreviated, and there's greater things to worry about, other than all sorts of vendor prefixes.
Yeah. Now, there's a couple of questions that have come up in the chat window I want to go ahead and address, just to make sure that we're completely clear. We are dealing with JavaScript, CSS, HTML as they exist in the standards. It's the standards. Even where we're implementing vendor-specific properties are part of the standard, just like data dash tags are part of the standard.
Absolutely.
And in your JavaScript, then, that means that you could bring in JavaScript libraries like jQuery or Knockout or any of the myriad, the thousands, tens of thousands, whatever, of JavaScript libraries that are available out there are all going to work in your Windows 8 app. So that's pretty awesome right there.
I think that's very cool. And in fact, that is a question we get a lot when we go to events and we're talking about this is, can I use my jQuery library? I love that. You sure can. One of the benefits, of course, of jQuery is that it helps you to write your code so that it would be independent of the browser, so you don't have to worry about it. Well, you're not having to worry about that anyway, so if the only reason why you were using jQuery was you were worried about browser compatibility, then you really wouldn't have to use it because you don't have that worry here. But if you're liking I like how it actually lets me go select stuff, well, stay tuned a little later when we're going to show you how you could use standards again to get something very similar in terms of how to get content and manipulate it and do all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, so again, just on the subject of clarifying some of the stuff that we covered in this section, the difference between Flexboxes and grids. Remember that Flexboxes and grids work completely separate. If you have defined a container to be a Flexbox by setting its display, then you should expect to set some of the -ms-flex properties on the child items. And then if you have specified that your container is a grid, then you should expect to be setting some of the -ms-grid properties of that child item. And a container is always either one or the other. And remember, the nature is that Flexboxes flow and grids give you some structure. So that's really the difference between those two. Now, throughout this whole course, as we're talking about the web standards, you may be wondering, what about shared code? What about writing websites and writing Windows 8 apps and using the same code for both? Is there an advantage there? Well, you take this skill set, if you've got a team or if it's just you take this HTML, CSS, JavaScript skill set, and that translates 100%. And then when you're coming from the web world into the Windows 8 world, you're running on an engine that is the same engine that's used to support the internet, and so it's going to run the code. It's going to run your JavaScript, it's going to run your HTML, so you can pretty much just copy and paste that code in, and it's going to run in Windows 8. Now, once you're working on a Windows 8 app for a while, you're going to add some Windows 8 characteristics. You're going to implement share, you're going to implement a list view, and all kinds of other things that are really great native offerings. And then once you do those aren't going to move back out to the web. A limited number of the controls and stuff that are available will move out, but by and large, most of the stuff won't move out to the web. So you're mostly sharing the skill set and some of the assets.
Right. And I think a nice little, disclaimer or caveat to what Jeremy was saying is, or I want to add one additional word, is that from web to app, it should probably work, and it probably will. And we're speaking about the code in terms of the rendered result of your app. So, some might have all these complex, ASP.NET, C#, back-end type code, and wondering if they could take that whole model and just make it work as an app. Well, we're talking about the rendered result of the page, not necessarily the code that may have created that rendered result. So keep that in mind. It's about the rendered HTML. If that worked in a browser rendered the way it was, then that's probably going to work also within the Windows 8 app land. But to think that you could take like an MVC app or an ASP.NET Web Forms app or site and just migrate that as is, that question's come up before, and it's not going to be that easy. It's going to require that you're dealing with really what the rendered state of that content's going to be. And from that perspective, there is a way to do some rendering and some dynamic stuff as well. We're just not there yet.
Yep. So these are some exciting layout provisions for us. It gives us the ability to lay an app out in a way that's dynamic and in a way that's going to respond to the user rotating the tablet, snapping your app, whatever. So these are some exciting additions. That wraps up this module. Let's go ahead and take a break and look at the next module coming up.